Thank you, alums, for being here. Can you hear me back there in the bleacher seats all right, yeah? Cheap seats, all right, very good. And it's wonderful to see some of my favorite faculty here, and of course some of my former students who had me in Western civilization or American foreign policy, some of you 10 years ago. I just want to say quickly, the class has really improved in the last 10 years since I taught it, just so you know. And again, for you guys who had me and endured Loconte, all I can say is angels of mercy protect you. It's great to be here, guys, such a great privilege. Let's just get into it. Beginning at 7 a.m., July 1st, 1916, the British Army unleashes what could only be called a hellish assault against German positions on the Western Front in France along the River Somme. Crossing no man's land, that dreadful dead zone that stretches between the enemy trenches, it's going to be a song, they're told. And so, at 7:30 a.m., on the opening day of the Battle of the Somme, nearly 100,000 British troops, to the sound of whistles, drums, and bagpipes, climb out of their trenches and attack. But the Germans have endured the pounding, and they're waiting, guns poised, for the British infantry. "We didn't have to aim," said a German machine gunner. "We just fired into them." Before the day is over, 19,240 British soldiers lay dead. Dead. Nearly twice that number wounded. Most killed in the first hour of the attack, many within the first minutes. So July 1st, 1916 marks the deadliest single day in British military history, and that's a lot of military history, right? Sir Frank Fox, the regimental historian, summarized the scene this way: "In that field of fire, nothing could live." Well, 24-year-old John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien, a second lieutenant in the British Expeditionary Force, is among their number. Tolkien spent several months in the trenches in the Somme under intense enemy fire. It is here, Tolkien explained later, that he began writing the early parts of his mythology about Middle-earth. In battered notebooks, he says, by candlelight, even some down in dugouts under shell fire. It's during this period, he says, that he conceived the story of the fall of Gondolin, the tale of how the elven city of Gondolin is betrayed into the hands of Morgoth. Here's a few lines from that story. "There at the end of a weary night in the gray of dawn they halted. He saw a land defiled and desolate. The trees were burned or uprooted. All now is but a welter of frozen mire, a reek of decay like a foul mist upon the ground." Let that image just hang in your mind for a moment. Tolkien called this the first real story of his imaginary world. He's talking, of course, about the war for Middle-earth. He's laying a foundation for his great epic work. And yet, while Tolkien is enduring the horror of the trenches, another young man with a gift for storytelling is hoping in vain that he can avoid the conflict altogether. Let me blow him up here for a moment. Clive Staples Lewis, C.S. Lewis, finds himself in a combat regiment on the Western Front, November 1917. He arrives in France as a second lieutenant on his 19th birthday. Happy birthday, Lewis. After 5 months of combat, Lewis has had enough of war. What he called the frights, the cold, the smell of high explosives, the horribly smashed men still moving like half-crushed beetles, he says. His poetry during this period rails against the silent, uncaring heaven. Here's a few lines. "Come, let us curse our master ere we die, for all our hopes in endless ruin lie. The good is dead, let us curse God most high." That's C.S. Lewis in 1917. He goes into the war as an atheist. He comes out an atheist. He was an atheist in a foxhole. But eventually, he's going to abandon his skepticism. He'll become a Christian, thanks in no small way to J.R.R. Tolkien. Both men survive the trenches of the First World War. Tolkien contracts trench fever. He's taken out of harm's way. Lewis is severely injured in a mortar attack that kills his sergeant, who's standing nearby. He's sent to a hospital in London, to recover from his wounds. And then the two men meet. Scholars in English literature, they meet for the first time at a faculty meeting in 1920. A faculty meeting. You guys, some of you guys know how I feel about faculty meetings. Just kidding, Tim, just kidding. Sort of kidding. It had to be one of those consequential faculty meetings of the 20th century there at Oxford. They soon realized they have a shared love of mythologies, of stories about a great and noble quest. Listen to what Lewis said about a meeting with Tolkien now, a few years later, as you're just starting to get to know each other. One night in Lewis's rooms at Magdalen College, December 3rd, 1929, he's writing a letter to a friend about this discussion with Tolkien. I was up till 2:30 on Monday. You know, usually I tell my students, conversations after midnight, well, maybe not such a good idea. This was a good idea. They're up till 2:30 on Monday, I was up till 2:30 talking to the Anglo-Saxon professor Tolkien, who came back with me to college. We sat discoursing of the gods and giants of Asgard for 3 hours, and then departing in the wind and rain, who could turn him out? For the fire was bright and the talk good. Well, a bond of friendship is being established that's going to transform their lives and their literary careers. Together, they will use their personal experience of combat to inform their Christian imagination. Like no other writers of their day, they will retrieve the concept of the epic and mythic hero, and they will reinvent him for the modern mind. Tolkien, of course, creates The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, one of the most influential books of the 20th century. Lewis earns fame from books such as Mere Christianity, the Screwtape Letters, and of course the Chronicles of Narnia, translated into at least 47 languages. Their shared experience of the sorrows and the triumphs of war, friends, war, helps to bring them together in friendship. Their common moral vision, their lifelong collaboration makes possible their great creative works. War, friendship, and imagination. That's the big picture. Let's take a few minutes to unpack it. Now remember what the soldiers at the Western Front were made to endure. The mortars, machine guns, tanks, poison gas, flamethrowers, barbed wire, trench warfare. Never before had technology and science so conspired to obliterate both man and nature. The mutilated remains of millions of men, farmers, factory workers, clerks, students, were consigned to graves scattered across Europe. And all for what? For what? People are asking. What difference did individuals make in this catastrophe? Who can believe in heroism or valor or virtue in the face of that? That's the mood of the hour. Lewis and Tolkien completely reject, let me underscore that, completely reject this attitude. In the worlds they create, everyone has a role to play in an epic battle between light and darkness. The moral and spiritual growth of their characters depends upon their individual choices. Listen to Tolkien on this. From The Lord of the Rings. Such is the course of deeds that move the wheels of the world, he says. Small hands do them because they must, while the eyes of the great are elsewhere. In Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia, we follow the adventures of the prevents each other, right? As they become part of a great war for the kingdom of Narnia against the White Witch and her forces of evil. Remember Lucy in Prince Caspian? Any Lucy fans out there? Lucy fans, got a few? Well, there's a moment of crisis when the outcome of the war is hanging in the balance. And this little girl is asked to do something that is difficult for her. Something that could be costly, something she doesn't want to do. She has to decide if she'll put away her fears and obey Aslan. I mustn't think about it. I must just do it. She could feel lion strength going into her. Now you are a lioness, Aslan said, and now all Narnia will be renewed. In the conflict between the White Witch and Narnia, between Mordor and Middle-earth, every soul is tested. Every creature must choose sides. Moral indifference is never an option. In The Lord of the Rings, the mission of Frodo Baggins is to carry the Ring of Power, of course, to the fires of Mount Doom and destroy it before it can destroy him. What's the defining quality of the Hobbit? Over to you, audience. The defining characteristic of the Hobbit. Courage. What else? Physical characteristic. Small, of course. He's small. I am not made for perilous quests, Frodo claims. Why was I chosen? You may be sure that it was not for any merit that others do not possess, replies Gandalf. Not for power or wisdom at any rate, but you have been chosen, and you must therefore use such strength and heart and wits as you have. Here again, Tolkien's experience at the Somme worked on his imagination. Where did Tolkien get the idea for his hobbits in the first place? After he became a professor at Oxford, and he's sitting and grading student papers, and some of my faculty friends out here, I want some candid answers here now. How many of you faculty guys actually look forward to grading student papers? Show of hands. David Tubbs, you're lying back there. You're lying. David's not lying. He's one of the most honest men I've ever met in my life. But most of us don't like grading paper, and Tolkien doesn't either. He finds a blank sheet of paper, finally, in all the massive papers, finds a blank sheet. Oh, finally a blank sheet, and he just starts scrawling on it. He scrawls these words on the blank sheet of paper. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. Later on, Tolkien reflected, eventually I thought I'd better find out what hobbits are like. Well, we know what hobbits are like. Listen to Tolkien. I've always been impressed that we're here, surviving, because of the indomitable courage of quite small people against impossible odds. The hobbits were made small, he explained, to show up in creatures of very small physical power the amazing and unexpected heroism of ordinary men at a pinch. What's he talking about? He's talking about the men he fought alongside in the trenches in France. They were not, for the most part, a professional army, the British Army. They were citizen soldiers, friends. Citizen soldiers, shopkeepers, bartenders, doctors, farmers, fishermen. My Sam Gamgee, Tolkien says, is indeed a reflection of the English soldiers, of the privates I knew in the 1914 war and recognized as so far superior to myself. Do you grasp what he's saying? One of the most beloved characters in fiction is based on the ordinary English soldier at his post, doing his duty, regardless of the cost. So, Lewis and Tolkien share this fundamental moral vision, the belief that the choices of every person matter. And our choices matter because we're all caught up in a great moral contest, a spiritual struggle against evil in the storms of life. Now, how can we contend and persevere through the storms? Through friendship and faith. Other things we could add, but let's focus on those two. Friendship and faith. Tolkien and Lewis proclaim the central importance of friendship in our common struggle against evil. Now, why friendship? I think that their personal knowledge of the fellowship of men under fire must rank as a defining experience of their literary lives. The theme of friendship pulses through each of the Narnia stories, right? It's like a force of nature. The Lewis scholar Alan Jacobs suggests that friendship even replaces romance as the preeminent expression of love in Lewis's stories. It flourishes among the children, between the children and the noble Narnians, and of course between Aslan and all who serve him in love and obedience. Well, Tolkien formed his own band of brothers before he went off to war. Geoffrey Smith, Rob Gilson, Christopher Wiseman, Tolkien there, second from the left. Is it surprising? Is it surprising that the cords of friendship tested and strengthened amid the suffering of war is one of the great themes of the fellowship of the Lord of the Rings? Frodo and his company make up the fellowship of the ring, right? The fellowship. When Frodo arrives at Crick Hollow, some of you remember this from the story, before setting out into the Old Forest, he's determined to leave on his own, right? He doesn't want to expose his companions to the perils that lie ahead. But Merry Pippin and Sam, they confront him before he can slip away, and they insist on coming with him. Frodo, deeply moved, nevertheless protests, but it does not seem that I can trust anyone. Merry is unflappable. It all depends on what you want. You can trust us to stick to you through thick and thin, to the bitter end, and you can trust us to keep any secret of yours closer than you keep it yourself. But you cannot trust us to let you face trouble alone, Frodo, and go off without a word. We're your friends. We know a good deal about the ring. We are horribly afraid, but we're coming with you or following you like hounds. Now, there's a question for all of us, isn't it? Do we have some people that we're following and who are following us like hounds? Like hounds. You form those friendships here at King's, I think, many of you. Well, loyalty in the crisis moment, it's one of the qualities of men in battle. I'll just say parenthetically here, as an Italian-American from New York, we love this quality, loyalty. We remember when you're with us in the trenches. We never forget. And if you're not with us in the trenches, we never forget. That's another story. All right. Well, caught up in the youth in the horrors of war, Lewis and Tolkien could never forget its sorrows, but neither did they succumb to its despair, as so many did in the post-war years. And I think the friendship that they deliberately pursued with one another and other men over the course of their lives was a huge part of the reason. It's a relationship born out of adversity, the tragedy of a global conflict. And out of their relationship comes something profoundly creative and ennobling. War, friendship, imagination. And so after the war, they seek to recapture something like the intense comradeship that sustained them during those crisis years, 1914, 1918. So what do? Go out for a beer, of course. At Oxford, they launched the Inklings, those who dabble in ink, the group of friends and fellow scholars, most of them Christians, who meet every week. When Lewis and Tolkien, they're the pillars of this group, they gather Tuesdays at the Eagle and Child Pub, every Thursday evening in Lewis's rooms at Magdalen College. They meet for nearly 20 years without fail, every Thursday night in Lewis's rooms. They gather to read aloud and to critique each other's works, what they're writing, what they're working on. Listen to Lewis. Theoretically, to talk about literature, but in fact, nearly always to talk about something better. Well, and some of them, they take walking tours together in the English countryside. Doesn't look like New York here, kids, does it? Yeah. Tolkien once complained that Lewis kept up a pace on these walking tours as if he were a drill sergeant. It is this community of friends that Lewis has in mind when he writes these unforgettable words in his book, The Four Loves. Something happens, Lewis says, when the whole group is together, each bringing out all that is best and wisest or funniest in all the others. Those are the golden sessions, he says, when 4 or 5 of us, after a hard day's walking, have come to our inn, when our slippers are on, our feet spread out towards the blaze, and our drinks at our elbows, when the whole world and something beyond the world opens itself to our minds as we talk, and an affection mellowed by the years enfolds us. Life, he says, natural life, has no better gift to give. Who could have deserved it? The creative partnership between Tolkien and Lewis must rank as one of the most consequential friendships of the 20th century. Both authors were deeply unsatisfied with the works of fiction being produced in the post-war years. They challenged one another to do something about it. Listen to Lewis. If they won't write the kind of books we want to read, he tells Tolkien, we shall have to write them ourselves. Tolkien begins work on his sequel to The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings. Lewis writes Out of the Silent Planet, the first in his space trilogy. But the fruit of their relationship is much richer than that. Lewis was an agnostic when he first met Tolkien in 1926. But Tolkien's Catholic Christian faith, his immense intelligence, their shared love of epic medieval literature, all of this has a profound effect on Lewis. It is Tolkien's conversation with Lewis on the night of September 13th, 1931. They talked until 3 o'clock in the morning about the nature of myth and about Christianity as the myth that became fact. The myth that became fact. It is this conversation that Lewis describes as the immediate human cause of his conversion to Christianity. Tolkien helped to unlock a door into Lewis's mind, and truth and light flooded in. Now, for his part, Lewis becomes, for Tolkien, his great advocate for pursuing his hobbitry. His hobbitry. As Tolkien put it, Lewis's gift to him was his, quote, sheer encouragement over many years to keep on. Listen to Tolkien. He, meaning Lewis, he was for long my only audience. Only from him did I ever get the idea that my stuff could be more than a private hobby. But for his interest and unceasing eagerness for more, I should never have brought The Lord of the Rings to a conclusion. Wow. When Lewis learns that The Lord of the Rings has been accepted for publication now, Tolkien's been working on it for 12 years. Started in 1937, finishes it around, you do the math. I was never a math guy, you know. They got the math requirements here at King's. I'm kind of like, yeah, whatever. When he learns that The Lord of the Rings has finally been accepted for publication, he writes a letter to Tolkien describing his sheer pleasure now of looking forward to having the book to read and to reread. And then he reveals in this letter to Tolkien the importance of the book, The Lord of the Rings, to both their lives. Here's what he says. So much of your whole life, so much of our joint life, so much of the war, so much that seemed to be slipping away into the past is now, in a sort, made permanent. Do you grasp what he's saying? Somehow, Tolkien has captured something of their life's journey together with all of its struggles and joys, and it's hidden, friends. It's hidden in the pages of this great work. Here is a glimpse of what friendship can look like when it reaches for a high purpose and is watered by the streams of sacrifice and loyalty and love. And yet this friendship and creativity and beauty, it emerged from the catastrophe of war. War. Narnia and Middle-earth are the setting of great conflicts and great quests. Here are war stories, friends, war stories wrapped in fantasy, which reveal ancient truths about the human condition. Tolkien and Lewis used the language of myth not to escape the world, as some of their critics charge, not to escape the world, but to suggest that real life has a mythic and heroic quality. And so their characters make a claim upon us. They challenge us to join with them in the struggle against evil. And yet, even this is not the whole of their achievement as we bring this to a close. It's not the whole of their achievement. Their friendship, the friendship between Tolkien and Lewis, I think, it gave them the fortitude and the faith to challenge the culture of cynicism and doubt and disillusionment that threatened to overshadow everything in the 1920s and 1930s. They reinforced within one another their belief that the struggle against darkness is possible. It's possible only because there's a source of grace and goodness outside of ourselves. Grace and goodness outside of us. By the end of his quest, think about it. By the end of his quest, Frodo, the ring bearer, has given up. He's given up the thought of ultimate success or even survival. Hope fails, an end comes, he tells Sam. We have only a little time to wait now. We are lost in ruin and downfall, and there's no escape. At the climax of his journey, at the fires of Mount Doom, despite all of his courage and strength, Frodo fails in his quest. He fails. He chooses not to destroy the ring, but instead succumbs to its power and places it once again on his finger. Remember what Frodo says, I do not choose now to do what I came to do. The ring is mine. The hero cannot by his own efforts prevail in the war against evil, because the forces arrayed against him, as well as the darkness within, make victory impossible. And so the mythic dimension of their stories reaches a zenith. Like the best fairy tales, they provide the consolation of the happy ending, the sudden joyous turn, as Tolkien put it, toward rescue and redemption. It's the reversal of a catastrophe, what Tolkien calls the eucatastrophe. The eucatastrophe, a decisive act of grace, which promises to overcome our guilt and restore what's been lost and to set things right. So Frodo's defeat, which is our defeat, it's overturned by a power stronger than our weakness. Tolkien identifies this power as, quote, that one ever-present person, capital P, who is never absent and never named. And so it is that Gollum, driven by his lust to dominate, bites off Frodo's finger that bears the ring, only to slip and plunge to his death into the fire. So the ring's destroyed, but not by Frodo, not by the Fellowship, but by a sudden and miraculous grace. Well, in Lewis's Narnia, the crowning moment of grace occurs in the last battle. As King Tirion, the children, and a faithful remnant of Narnians fight their way to the entrance of the stable, the last battle of the last king of Narnia. Spoiler alert. You know how it ends. We're led to believe that inside the stable is certain death, the stronghold of an all-powerful evil. I feel in my bones, says Poggin, that we shall all, one by one, pass through that dark door before morning. I can think of 100 deaths I would rather have died. As the company is forced inside, all hope seems lost. And here again comes the joyous turn, because the great lion has invaded the stable, cast out the demon Tash, turned the stable into a portal to Aslan's country. For these two giants of literature, friends, there's only one truth, one singular event that can end the long war against evil, undo the tragedy of the human condition, and bring lasting peace: the return of the king. In Narnia, the king is Aslan, the great lion, the Christ figure. Only Aslan knows the way to that blessed realm that lies beyond the sea. The light ahead was growing stronger, writes Lewis in the last battle. And then he goes on. Lucy saw that a great series of many-colored cliffs led up in front of them like a giant staircase, and then she forgot everything else, because Aslan himself was coming, leaping down from cliff to cliff like a living cataract of power and beauty. This king comes in power and beauty as the voice of conscience and the source of consolation, as the lion and the lamb. Here is the union of tenderness and severity, of terror and comfort intertwined. In Tolkien's story, this king is Aragorn, the chief epic hero of the Lord of the Rings. He is heir to the kingship of Gondor. His life is devoted to the war against Sauron. His true stature, though, is made known only after Sauron's defeat, when he finally assumes his throne. And here's how Tolkien describes that moment in The Lord of the Rings. But when Aragorn arose, all that beheld him gazed in silence, for it seemed to them that he was revealed to them now for the first time. Tall as the sea kings of old, he stood above all that were near. Ancient of days he seemed, and yet in the flower of manhood. And wisdom sat upon his brow, and strength and healing were in his hands, and a light was about him. And then Faramir cried, "Behold the king." Here is a vision of human life that is at once terrifying and sublime. Here is a world, our world, in which every soul is caught up in an epic struggle against evil. It's a story of sacrifice and courage and clashing armies, the return of the king. It is in these works of fiction, these mythic tales of loss and recovery, of betrayal and redemption, that we find a clue to the meaning of our earthly journey. Is everything sad going to come untrue? Asks Sam. For the creators of Narnia and Middle-earth, here is the deepest source of hope for the human story. It's the belief that God and goodness are the ultimate realities, and that the shadow of sin and suffering will finally be lifted from our lives. The great war will be won. This king, who brings strength and healing in his hands, will make everything sad come untrue. Thank you for listening.